Um, Anyway, so our first reading today that we heard, that was telling a story from about 2,700 years ago. The people of Israel had been forced into captivity in Babylon, and then about 50 years later, they were able to return to Jerusalem. And much of what they had come back to was destroyed. The great temple had been demolished, and a lot of their city was gone. And many of the people that had been forced into exile never lived to see returning to their temple, because it was 50 years' time. Many people would have passed. People that were just babies may not have even seen the temple when they were able to return to Jerusalem. And in this time, in the story that we're reading, the people have finally gathered. They've gathered where the temple was. They've gathered in that rubble. And the law is being read to them for hours. It says from daybreak until about noon. And while the people were gathered there and listening to the law, they began to weep. And as I thought about those people gathered there in that rubble, listening to the words of their God and weeping, I thought of how many people right now in our own world, and maybe some of us, are weeping as well. I heard a story on NPR today about a woman returning to her home in Palestine and said, "I know my house is gone, but we will set up a tent and we will be on our land." I thought about the many pictures that I'm sure most of us have seen of the devastating fires in Los Angeles and what it is like for people to return to their homes devastated, for iconic parts of our history to be gone in that city. And I thought about the people on our border between Mexico and the U.S., people that already had very little hope, but still had some hope, and are now being turned around or filled with even more fear in this moment. For the refugees and the immigrants in our world right now that are fleeing violence and poverty, seeking safety, food, and simply the ability to work for their families, I imagine for those people, they know so much what these Israelites were feeling and what they were facing. Because they are the exiles, the captives. They're unable to move with freedom or dignity, left either to the harsh elements of the desert or the cruelty of others and a broken immigration system. And I think it makes total sense for all of those people in the face of destruction and us to feel like sitting on the rubble and weeping. As I was watching the news this week, I found myself thinking back to about 14 years ago when I was living in Manchester, New Hampshire. And it was the only time I lived in a place where the primaries really mattered, and there was all that like excitement and energy there. And I was in line with many, many other people. It was really one of the only times where I've ever had to like really wait in line to vote in the primary. And you know, all the major news teams were there. And even in that line, I hadn't decided if I was going to vote for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. But it was such this amazing time to think, I'm going to get to vote for either a woman or a person of color, and that there is this decent chance that part of this glass ceiling is going to be shattered, and how much hope I felt in that moment. And then a few years later, when I moved here, I remember exactly where I was driving on I-94 when I heard that the marriage amendment didn't pass, and which meant that that same-sex marriage was legal, and how much hope I felt in that moment, that it was like, yes, like these things are changing, like we're making a difference. This world is moving in this direction where more people can be celebrated and can live freely and experience love in their lives in an open and beautiful way. And now, approximately 15 years from all of that, I feel like I've been punched in the gut, and I imagine maybe some of you do too. That excitement, that energy, that hope, that love, where did that go? And today feels like a good day to sit in ruins and weep. because it seems like we are just watching the destruction of so much of what people have worked for. In our first reading, when those people were gathered in the rubble weeping, Ezra told them to stop crying, to go out and celebrate. And he said, your strength comes from the joy of the Lord. And as a chaplain, I kind of immediately recoil to that, because we don't ever tell people to stop crying, right? Let your emotions out. It's good to cry. Let it out. Just be there, right? And so at first I'm like, no, let these people cry. Let them cry on the rubble. Let us cry right now. But what the religious leaders at that time were doing were reminding the people who they were, that no matter their history, no matter what the future held, their identity was not as captive or as refugee. Their identity was God's chosen people, God's beloved. And that is where they were to find their strength. That is where they were to find their joy, to go eat and drink and make sure they take a portion of that food and drink and give it to someone that does not have that. The people in that rubble needed to remember who they were. They needed to be united together to celebrate on their temple, even if it was rubble. And our gospel this morning intentionally connects us to that first reading. We've jumped about 500 years later, and Jesus is in his own synagogue, and he reads from the book of Isaiah. And the book of Isaiah was written when the people were in captivity. And this is the lines that he chose to read. The Spirit of our God is upon me, because the Most High has anointed me to bring good news to those who are poor. God has sent me to proclaim liberty to those held captive, recovery of sight to those who are blind, and release to those in prison, to proclaim the year of our God's favor. And much like Ezra, when Jesus read these words of Isaiah, he was reminding and calling people back to know who they are in their identity in God. And moreover, he was proclaiming a whole different way to understand what it meant to be God's people. That no longer did you necessarily need that temple, but that our identity and God's presence is in all things and in all of creation. That all people are called to assert and live this message. That it is the joy of God where our strength is rooted, and that we then are called to set the captive free. And that this is now what religion is about. This is what worship is about. It's not a physical structure where we gather, but rather living and being in the world, being a people that can fulfill that same message. And so today, as in many ways we watch our world crumble and watch ruins and watch this ebb and flow of human history, we need to remember who we are in God. I'm trying to figure out how exactly I'm supposed to be living in the world right now. I find myself watching the news a lot less, and I think that's okay. I don't think it's okay to totally disengage, but it's okay to take care of yourself. And if listening or seeing images is too much, then maybe reading stories is totally a way to gather that information as well. And I also feel like weeping, and that's okay too. The people in the first reading, they spent the whole morning in the rubble weeping, and weeping is okay. We don't need to stop that either. But what we need to do is keep remembering who we are, and to remember that no one, nothing can take away the joy and strength that comes from our God. So we take care of ourselves, we do what we need to do to keep living our days, and then we keep gathering together, gathering here, gathering in our broader communities, connecting online, like our folks that are here with us online, finding all the ways to remind one another who we are, that we are God's beloved. And then to keep in that joining, to reach out then to those that are most at risk, for the immigrants, for those from the LGBTQ community to keep reaching out and keep reminding one another that we are beloved, we are God's people, and that strength is beyond any other person's strength. So we are to bring glad tidings to the poor and set the captive free and heal the broken. That was Jesus' call, and that's our call today. Our history is unfortunately full of people in power who think that they can take away the temple of God. But the reality is the temple is within each and every one of us and is huge and alive in this world. And so we will keep gathering on the rubble of what it is and keep celebrating and keep building up and keep reminding ourselves and one another who we are in God.